Welcome to a Sandra Day O'Connor Institute Issues and Answers conversation on the economy with John Cochrane. I'm Liam Julian, Vice President of Programs and Policy for the O'Connor Institute. John H. Cochrane is the Rosemarie and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. His monetary economics publications include the book The Fiscal Theory of the Price Level and articles on monetary policy and inflation. He writes occasional op-eds, mostly in the Wall Street Journal, and blogs as the Grumpy Economist at grumpy-economist.com. That's an abbreviated bio. There's a lot more. John, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. And you remind me, I need to update my bio. I have a book coming out called Crisis Cycle on the Euro in June. And sorry, I always got to advertise my books.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. That's great. Thanks for bringing that up. Well, John, the last time we talked was about 2 years ago, and your previous book that we just mentioned, The Fiscal Theory of the Price Level, had just come out. Timing was apt from a marketer's perspective because it came out right at the moment when we were seeing sort of the highest inflation in this country we'd seen in about 40 years. So I thought we'd start by saying, we look at the headlines now, and inflation is not necessarily in there as much as it was when we last spoke 2 years ago. Yet it's still not necessarily down to the sort of 2% target that the Fed often talks about. So maybe you could tell us where we're at right now in terms of inflation, what you're looking at, what you're thinking about.
Yeah, I think it is lower, but still risky. And if you want a historical precedent, 1976 and 1979 keep me up at night.
Okay.
For those of you too young to remember, there was a wave of inflation in 1976. It subsided, but didn't quite get back to where it had been before. And then a supply shock, the oil shock of 1979 hit. The Fed and Treasury accommodated it, as they tend to do with such shocks. We got the big stagflation of the 1970s, followed by the big recessions of the 1980s, when the Fed finally woke up and said, we have to do something about it. So we had this big surge of inflation, and it is always due to monetary and fiscal policy, the huge blowout spending of the COVID era, plus the Fed's accommodation of the supply shocks of the COVID era. Nobody wants to acknowledge that's what they did, but that's what they did. They fought COVID like a war, with inflation as well as massive spending. And then here we are facing the next supply shock, which raises prices and lowers the economy's productive capacity. So the Fed and the government will be hard pressed to make a difficult decision about what to do. Of course, maybe remove the supply shock. This time we're doing it to ourselves as opposed to the sheiks doing it to us. So I see us as a time of fragility. I don't like to forecast, but there's certainly a very plausible scenario that replays a 1979 style event.
That's interesting. We've been reading about stagflation. I've seen that word start to kind of creep up. And again, this was a word that you never saw in the news for the past 40 years. But you're saying that this is, in your opinion, you're not forecasting, but you believe this is a distinct possibility given where we're at today.
Yeah, and this is not unusual. Even, read the Fed. They say, big tariffs simultaneously raise prices and reduce the economy's productive capacity, so lead to less output. And we're supposed to choose between those two, but we can't make them both better with the very limited tools we have at hand. So that's not an unusual prognosis. The question is what to do about it, and that's much harder.
So what do you think the Fed should be doing at this point, given where we're at?
I'm much more of a hawk on these issues.
Okay.
Inflation is like cockroaches. Just because you got it down to the last couple doesn't mean you're done. And the Fed's credibility is very much in question. Everyone kind of gave them a pass for missing the COVID era and post-COVID inflation. Oh, supply shocks. Oh, the forecasts were wrong. Oh, the dog ate my homework. But, the repetition right out of the gate would lend people to say, really? Is the Fed really committed to bringing down inflation? And the Fed has said, in some sense, they are willing to tolerate what they call another transitory. So the way it works is tariffs raise the level of prices, but they don't lead to further inflation. So if the Fed views its job as over the long run bringing inflation back to 2%, but so what if there are shocks that give you transitory surges of inflation, which is how the Fed sees its job, then you're going to have a lot of transitory surges of inflation. So there's a deeper question here of whether the Fed should view its job with quite such alacrity about occasional big inflations. Us peasants with pitchforks were pretty mad about the price level going up 20%, even though the inflation rate didn't keep going. So I think it's really time to bottle up the inflation genie and also not to accommodate administration policy on tariffs. The Fed went along with the COVID spending blowout. It helped. In 2020, the Fed agreed with the Treasury that we have a warlike calamity here. Don't worry about spending money. They printed $3 trillion and gave it to the Treasury to hand out. So they were all in. Now, I think, why aren't they saying from the rooftops, hey, look what a great job we did? I think everybody recognizes that spending was vastly overdone and contributed to inflation. I think we recognize the mistake that it was not lack of demand that was causing the economy to collapse. It was because it was locked down. So we didn't want to necessarily go do that all over again. But the Fed really hasn't faced that choice. So I think it's really time for the Fed to think harder about their long run strategy, to promise that they won't do this, because that'll help keep down the inflation and the shock, and not to go along. So, like I said, last time they went along because they thought it was the same thing. I don't think anyone at the Fed thinks massive tariffs are a great idea, and so, well, use your independence. And let's put this in a nice way. The administration wants tariffs. They want to see the full economic effect of tariffs because they think that are good. Great. Why should the Fed not say, okay, we are not going to paper over the effects of tariffs. You want the effects of tariffs? You got it. We're not going to paper it over with some inflation for you. Now, that's a very hawkish view. I guess I just shot my chance of being Fed chair here, but you can't get lower than zero anyway.
So you're saying when you say they should not accommodate, you mean that they should keep rates where they are, if not raise them. Is that your thinking?
I think they should keep rates where they are for now.
Okay.
They should be prepared to promptly react to inflation when it comes. Nobody really knows what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. And I think the Fed learned twice that reacting to forecasts is a bad idea, because its forecasts, like everyone else's forecasts, are junk. In 2016, it reacted to a forecast and raised rates, and it said, oh boy, that was a mistake. And then in the big surge of inflation, the Fed's forecasts were always, oh, inflation's going to end next month. It's always going to go back to 2%. It reacted to those forecasts, and the whole thing got out of hand. So but on the other hand, it ended up not reacting to inflation. The Fed did nothing for a full year while inflation surged to 9%. The Fed, even in the 1970s, the Fed didn't wait that long. So don't react to forecasts. React quickly to inflation if it comes, and don't get into, is it a supply shock or a demand shock or transitory or whatever. Just react quickly to inflation when it comes. But the Fed's tools are limited, and as long as we have fiscal policy that's out of control, the Fed may not be able to control inflation that well. And that's the other current conundrum, that there are things that happen that the Fed has limited ability to do anything about.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to talk about that because, of course, your book, The Fiscal Theory of the Price Level, is concerned with how fiscal policy affects the price level. You just mentioned tariffs and how they raise the price level as well. I'm curious about the interaction that we might see between fiscal policy that we're continuing to spend and also tariffs that would raise the price level, how these two would work together. Oh, and also, as an addendum to that, you said tariffs raised the price level, but not the rate of inflation. Is that correct? But I guess one question I had is it possible that people reacting to tariffs would start to buy more, and that could cause the inflation rate to increase? Or is that, you're saying that would be a one-time thing?
Yeah. So we have to... I'm glad you asked this because I was a little
Okay.
fast and loose here.
Okay. Okay.
Two lessons of economics. Don't mistake the price level for the inflation rate. And we make that mistake all the time. The worthies kept saying, well, the inflation has gone back down. And the peasants with pitchforks said, yeah, but the level of
History.
prices is 20% higher.
Right.
So, and the peasants with pitchforks were right. So the price level goes up. That's an inflation rate while it goes up, and then it
Yeah.
stops.
Right.
You have no more inflation rate, but you have higher prices. The other one is don't confuse relative prices with the level of prices.
Okay.
So tariffs raise the level of imported goods relative to everything else. But that doesn't mean why do the imported goods go up rather than everything else goes down. It drives a wedge between them, but where's the overall level? That's always monetary or fiscal policy. So there's relative prices, one thing versus another. The level of everything, loosely, you can say, well, how much money does the government give us? If they
Sure.
give us
Okay.
more money, the level of everything goes up. If they give us less money,
Yeah.
then that relative, it'll be the other stuff that goes down.
Okay.
So I spoke quickly because almost always the Fed and the Treasury, they're both in charge here. They don't like anything to go down, so they will choose the solution where one of them goes up and then stays up. So now, okay, first step, tariffs come in, the imports go up because we get enough accommodation to raise overall prices that much. And then you said, oh, does that build in, a further surge? Well, again, the overall level of things, the level of the pond in which the various boats go up and down, is in the end set by monetary and fiscal policy, by
Okay.
how much money, how much government debt they give us. But it is quite reasonable for people to see this and say, oh, this is troublesome. We have a situation where there's inflation and the economy's tanking. We think the government's going to do exactly what it did during COVID, exactly what it did in the 1970s, and funnel more money at us to try to solve this problem. And then they expect more inflation. Now, there's some dynamics here. Inflation is like stocks. If we all expected inflation next year, we'd raise our prices right now. So that dynamic is there, exactly what you said. If we all think things are going up now, we go out and buy. In fact, we're seeing that already. People expect tariffs. They're running out to buy everything as fast as they can. That's going to drive up prices away. So that dynamic exists, but on top of, it's always in the end, the fiscal and monetary policy that justifies it. So your dynamic is right. But if everybody knew the Fed's not going to let this happen, then the dynamic couldn't get going. And that's why I think it's so important for the Fed to get out in front and say, we're not going to let this happen again. Because if they say, well, we'll allow a transitory price level rise, then exactly what you just said happens. Then everybody goes out, raises prices now, and then the stagflation is worse. And then they feel like they need to feed it with more money. And here we go, 1970s again.
I see. Well, let's talk about the tariffs specifically. You had mentioned the administration. They put the tariffs in place. They want to see the effect of tariffs. I gather that you think those effects are negative. That you perhaps don't believe that these tariffs should have ever been put in place. I don't know if that's a fair reading of your position, but um, how do you think these tariffs are sort of fitting into the sort of administration's broader sort of vision it seems to have about how it would like to shape or reshape the economic system and the global economy? What do you think they're thinking? And could you tell us where you think they might be right, where you think they might be less right?
You asked a big question.
Yeah, I threw a lot out there. Yeah, sorry.
The tariffs seem to be a answer in search of a question. And you see that because the answer is always the same, but the questions keep changing.
Mm,
Is it to reshore manufacturing? Is it to rebalance the international system? Is it for national security? Is it a temporary threat to make the foreigners lower their tariffs in the end? Is it to raise revenue? I don't know. Seems to be all of the above. Well, uh, anytime you see a patent medicine that's a magic elixir for all that ails you, you ought to be a little bit suspicious. Um, so then, reverse engineering what they're up to. I don't know. I have a journalist friend had a very good hypothesis that in the end, if something good comes out of it, they'll claim this was four-dimensional chess to attain that something good in the end, which they probably will. So the economics of tariffs are really simple. Adam Smith figured this out in the 1760s. And it's funny, we don't question force equals mass times acceleration, but somehow we're still stuck in pre-1760 economics. The right economic answer is unilateral free trade. No tariffs on anything coming and going out. That's kind of easy to explain. Why this takes a long time is answering the 100 what ifs and fallacies, which I'll make you come up with the 100 fallacies, which ones you want to go down. So that's from the economic perspective. Even trade does not have to be fair to be beneficial. If somebody wants to sell you something and it's worthwhile, and maybe they could offer you a lower price, that's unfair, but if the price is more than what you're willing to pay, it's still advantageous to you to do it. If they are subsidizing something, that seems very unfair to the Americans who want to compete with that. But from the country's point of view, overall, whether they are subsidizing, if China wants to tax its citizens and subsidize electric cars, well, that's still, flowers and chocolates. That's better than taxing American citizens to subsidize electric cars. That's very hard for most people to digest because the unfairness rankles completely. Anyway, unilateral free trade is the economically best answer. Open, highly trading countries have always been the most prosperous. Countries that close themselves off, either under a national security or a do-it-yourself or reshore manufacturing or protect infant industries. That's the strategy most of Latin America followed. That's the Peronist strategy from Argentina. It's what India tried to do for 50 years of poverty after the Second World War. It just never works. Now, I say economic damage. There is a narrow national security argument for some tariffs. I have to admit that. Aircraft carriers are costly, but economists don't run around and saying, don't build aircraft carriers. We run around and say, check the cost-benefit analysis. Is it really, do you want for national security? Do you want 10 aircraft carriers or do you want a $100 billion chip plant? I don't know. You go pick, Mr. General, but let's keep track of the costs and benefits. Now, it's a narrow national security. Everything gets wrapped in the flag. We can't buy from China because national security. Well, there's only so much money. And if you impoverish the American economy, then there's a lot fewer aircraft carriers you can afford to buy. I just read, for example, rare earths. National defense uses 0.1% of America's rare earths, and you can stockpile them. Let's have a scenario for exactly how important that is. And national security does not justify the number of tariffs we see. So why are tariffs on Mexican avocados important to national security? Why are tariffs on European and Canadian steel, which we might use to make aircraft carriers? Why is that important to national security? I think it needs a very careful analysis of just what is the national security scenario that requires tariffs. But I'll admit that's a possibility to pure free trade. So I think I've gone on for a while, and I forget what your question was at this point. But
Well, I'll ask you because you said, yeah, no. I mean, I asked a lot of them. You said that tariffs. From an economic perspective, the answer is sort of free trade. Of course, the administration, government, they consider more than just an economic perspective. You brought up national security. Do you think outside of economics, are there any other compelling interests that could be served by having tariffs in place?
Other than there's some sort of vague geostrategic thing,
Yeah.
but that's economics again. So it's fun here at Hoover. We have a fun discussion with the national security and the economics people. And there's a lot of we need to invest to dominate the industrial policy to dominate the economies of the 21st century. Okay, great. How well has that worked out in the past? When I see government boondoggles, I live in California. The high-speed train is what happens when the U.S. tries to invest to dominate the technologies of the 21st century. So I would call that economic
Mhm.
and geoeconomic strategic wars. I don't know that's somewhere half between economics and strategy. I'm very dubious at the prospect that we need to turn America into the old Soviet Union because of some vague Chinese economic threat. The national security threat, something different. Now, the other part of the supposed goal of tariffs, one was somehow it's going to improve our economy. They're taking us, every time they sell us something, they're sapping American vitality. I don't know where that comes from. But there's the larger rebalance the world system, the fascination with trade deficits. So here, you have to learn to follow the money. Here's another principle of economics: follow the money around, and in the end, ignore the money because it's real
Okay.
stuff that counts. So when that's another way of saying the trade deficit equals the capital account surplus. So let's follow the money around a little bit. China works hard, puts stuff on boats, takes our pieces of paper in return. Well, that might be a nice deal, wouldn't it? Uh, that's now considered somehow they're doing us a great damage. But I don't know, we can print paper a lot cheaper than they can send us stuff. But alas, those pieces of paper are only good for buying things in the US. Nope. What do you do with the dollar? Well, China might buy coal from Australia with the dollars, but then what do the Australians do with the dollars? They got to turn around and buy stuff from the US, either now or in the future. And so the trade deficit, what's happened is those pieces of paper are essentially promises that we will turn around and do the opposite in the future. China wants to save more than it invests. So what it does is it puts stuff on boats, it works hard, puts stuff on boats and sends it to us. Well, that's nice, but it's not a gift. They do not send stuff for free, no matter what this dumping and all the rest of it says. They want it back eventually because when they get old, and they're getting old fast, they want us to work hard and put stuff on boats to take back those pieces of paper. So be careful what you wish for. You just might get it. And even in the best scenario, there's a future where we work hard, we send stuff on boats to China, and they give us back our pieces of paper. And not even that could happen sooner rather than later. So when the administration, partly there's this grand rebalancing of international capital markets and so forth. Let's think about what that means.
Okay.
Suppose we cut off all international trade right now. Now foreigners can't get dollars, so they can't buy stuff from the US. President Trump was just in Saudi Arabia trying to get them to invest in the US. And my first thought was, how do you expect them to get the dollars to invest in the US if they can't sell stuff to us? Saudi Arabia sells oil, it sells it to other people, it gets the dollars, but those people have to get stuff. The only way to get dollars to invest in the US is to sell us stuff. So if that turns off, all of a sudden, the US has to match our investment with our own savings, and the federal government can't run a budget deficit anymore. What we've done is the federal government, through huge deficit spending, has encouraged Americans to consume, so that we're taking that foreign money now, all that stuff is coming on boats. Our plan for paying it back in the future is not that we built factories and we will, with their great profits, we will then send stuff back in the future. No, our plan is America will raise taxes in the future and we will consume less than we produce in order to send stuff back. So you might just get all of that instantly. If we turn off all trade this summer, the
Right.
budget deficit goes to zero. All of those lovely checks the government sends to people to support their consumption goes to zero. America must save equal to its own investment. Interest rates skyrocket. Be careful what you wish, you just might get it. So
Yep.
to wrap up, sorry, this went on a little bit.
No, this is
The
great.
big picture is dollars always come back, either as demand for goods or as demand for future goods, as capital account that funds our investment in the US or funds our federal government budget deficit. We've largely chosen to do the latter, which is too bad. We consumed rather than investment. But it doesn't. It is not something where they just take from us.
Yep. Yeah. And this is a certain privilege that we have because we make dollars in some
Well,
sense.
I think that privilege is a little bit overstated. The privilege says that they're willing to take just dollars and sit on them.
Yep.
Now, that's a
Yep.
privilege. First of all, that's not a horrible thing. It's a privilege that we get to print money and the rest of the world sends us free stuff to get the money that they find useful to make their transactions. But
Yeah.
it's limited.
Yeah.
And you can't expand it, just like the government. Our US government prints dollars. There's about 2 trillion of them outstanding, which means the US government has been able to run a $2 trillion of cumulative deficit without having to raise taxes. That's lovely.
Yeah.
But if you do 3 or 4 trillion, you can sense what's going to happen. You can't scale that up. You're just going to get inflation. So
Yeah.
it's a one-time benefit. It's a one-time consumption benefit. But I don't think it's as big as most people think.
Okay.
It's the promise. It's people's faith in the U.S. It's not the privilege of printing some sort of money that's unbacked that is useful. People are willing to lend the U.S. a lot more than they are willing to lend Argentina because they trust American institutions to pay that back with
Right.
tax revenues higher than spending, which means spending control at some point in the future. Now, I don't know quite where that faith comes from. I'm delighted that they have such faith in us, but let's not tempt that fate.
Yeah. And we have been, though. I mean,
Well,
correct?
yeah, I would prioritize faith in Americans' fiscal institutions and our commitment to repaying our debts. That's what lets foreigners lend to us, not something magic about the dollar in international transactions and exorbitant privilege and so forth.
Okay. All right. That's so. We've talked previously about fiscal policy. You think we need to rein this thing in and fast. Um, there are examples, are there not, of countries that have racked up a significant amount of debt. Japan comes to mind. Seem to have kind of muddled through. Is your opinion, John, that we're at a sort of a crisis point with the fiscal situation? Could we continue to muddle through for another few decades? Like, what does this look like in your mind when it all falls apart, if it falls apart? Or can this just kind of keep going?
It can keep going until all of a sudden it stops.
Okay, all right, yeah,
So debt crises are like bank runs. They are crises of faith. If you knew it was coming tomorrow, it would have happened today.
right.
Because if I could tell you the debt crisis would come tomorrow, this interview would be over. We're running down to
There
the
you go,
border
yeah,
right now.
right. See you
Right?
later, John. Yeah.
So it leads to our fragility. We are, as is Japan, it can muddle on for a long time until all of a sudden everybody loses faith. And that usually takes a shock of some sort. Now, Japan is the outlier. Many countries have said, let's be like Japan. Oh, Turkey, Argentina, Brazil, the United Kingdom. So everybody else seems to run in Italy, Greece, Ireland. The rest of the world seems to run into trouble long before we hit. I think Japan's only about 150% of GDP net debt. Now, and Japan is fragile too, because what really counts in the end is the debt service costs.
Yeah.
How much you got to pay in interest. And, if the bank said, hey, Liam, buy a fancy McMansion and I'll lend you money at negative 1% interest rate. You go, hallelujah, honey, let's go buy a big house.
Yeah.
Except they said, oh, by the way, that's a variable rate loan. And then when interest rates go up, that's when the party ends. So same for the US, same for Japan. At low rates, who cares? At high rates, it's unsustainable. But the debt really isn't the problem. There's no magic debt to GDP ratio. It's about debt relative to people's faith in our ability to repay it. Government debt is a good and great thing when people have faith that you will repay it. Government debt allows the government to meet a war, a crisis, a recession with a flood of money, borrowed money, which it then promises to pay back very slowly over time. If you didn't have government debt, you would have to make every expenditure this year's taxes. So, imagine trying to pay for World War II with the taxes only on people during World War II. You couldn't have done it. So government debt in a situation where people have faith it will be repaid slowly over decades is wonderful. And that's our problem. It's not so much the debt. It's, the entitlements, which is also the entitlements and the rat holes. Our government is running primary deficits. From World War II until 2000, the pattern was in a recession, deficits. But when you get back to normal economy, primary surpluses. Primary means not counting interest payments. So just like you, if you're making the interest payments on your credit card and a little more, you're paying it down over time. And we used to do that, and we've stopped doing that. So it's the big spending that is the problem. Now, that's good and bad news. You said do it fast. You don't really have to do it fast. What you have to do is get people, get on a trajectory that people are once again sure we will eventually pay it off over decades. So that doesn't mean accounting gimmicks. That doesn't mean 10-year budget windows, all the creatives. That doesn't mean the promises of what we might do 2 days after this administration is out. That means the institutions are really fixed so that even if you're borrowing in the short run, you pay it back in the long run. And that comes from tax reform, not tax gimmicks. It comes from economic growth, because tax revenue is tax rate times income. More income is better than higher tax rate. It comes from education, immigration, productivity, all those things that grow the economy are better ways to solve that problem. And of course, entitlement reform, spending reform. Did I mention the $100 billion California rat hole high-speed train? You got to spend money as if taxpayers have to pay it back, because eventually they do. So that kind of long run, in some sense, that's easier than cutting next year's deficit. In some sense, it's harder because our government doesn't really have appetite for that kind of institutional reform. I think bond markets have said this is a great and good country. In the past, you've had bipartisan commissions that have reformed taxes, reformed spending, reformed entitlements. Surely America will do this again before we run into an Argentinian-style debt crisis. But that faith could waver.
Interesting. It's interesting to hear you don't think that there's any a debt to GDP ratio. There's not one that sort of you tip, or you read sometimes that once your spending on interest exceeds your defense budget, that this is sort of a crime. You're saying this kind of things don't matter. It's whether you will. The perception is you will pay this back. Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's no magic debt to GDP. It's debt relative to people's expectation, faith, that somehow sooner or later, after you've tried everything else, you get around to solving the spending problems and cure that debt. My colleague Neil Ferguson loves to cite Ferguson's law, not his Ferguson, another Ferguson, that it's interest rate relative to defense spending. Now, that was true historically. When defense spending was huge and other kinds of spending were small. So, if you're England fighting the Napoleonic Wars, then defense spending relative to interest costs on the debt is what counts. But defense in the US is couch change. No great empire ever spent 3% of its GDP on defense. 10, 15, 20 was more normal.
Sure.
So, and we're talking about the Europeans and how they only spend 2 or don't spend 2 or whatever. Look, welfare, social programs are in the 20, 30% of GDP. France spends 58% of GDP, most of it on social programs and checks to its citizens. 2% on defense, 3% on defense, that is couch change. So I think in the modern world, the Ferguson's law should be about interest expense compared to welfare programs, because that's what's really the competition. And that's good news too, because I don't want to say cut, but surely we can spend 58% of GDP a little more efficiency, my cher ami française, and same for the US. So the debt it's just one element. I think it makes you fragile. It makes you susceptible to higher interest rates. My nightmare scenario, too, is not so much that the debt gets too big. It's that our borrowing capacity is thereby inhibited. So here's my scenario. China blockades Taiwan. Global financial crisis, global recession, military problem. Uncle Sam turns to the markets and said exactly what we said in 2020 to 2021. We need $10 trillion. We need it now. And we need fresh savings. We need you to give over your savings to us for $10 trillion so we can bail out all the banks again and stimulate the economy and write people's checks, and this time invest in a military stat. Now, having just suffered a 20% haircut from the last inflation and having seen no progress on fundamental fiscal reforms, you're going to ask, what's your plan for paying this back, buddy? Oh, we haven't solved that one yet. So I think every crisis needs a spark, and that's the kind of spark I see.
Interesting.
So it's not just the spark of the debt problem. It's the moment when you go to the bank and say, I need one more loan, three-quarters of which to pay off the old loans,
Mm.
and another one because I really need to build I need to build an ADU in my backyard. And the bank says that's it. But of course now you really needed the money. So I think the fragility of our debt is the issue, as opposed to the absolute size of it.
Interesting. Let me ask you two questions. These might be sort of might not be great questions, but in your scenario, would it not just be the case that one of two things could happen, where sort of just the rates would rise on bonds, and would just you could get the money, but at just a much higher rate, or because we're the United States, we print the money. What perhaps the simplistic questions, but
Oh no, I love. They're not simplistic; those are deep questions.
okay,
Now, when they won't lend you money and you say, okay, we'll just print it, what you
yeah,
get is inflation.
right,
And when you've promised to pay back $100 and then you inflate it away so that the $100 buys half as much as it used to, that is exactly the same as defaulting on the debt.
okay,
So inflation is just economically equivalent to default. Now you have another choice. You can say, well, we're just not paying it back. And I don't think it's unthinkable for the US to essentially default on its debt rather than print it up. We can always print it up, but I think we've just discovered that voters are really mad
mm,
if you
right,
print up money. Inflation is a way of making people who hold money pay the tax to refinance the debt, as opposed to, well, how about those evil foreigners? They've already floated the idea of taxing foreign holdings of treasuries. That is equivalent to a default. So, on this great thing where China sent us stuff and we sent them pieces of paper, and we say China did us a terrible thing, I would be worried about this if I was China. Are they really going to make good on those promises? Is America really going to
mm,
go back to work and put stuff on boats in return for their pieces of paper? Or are they just going to say, "Where those pieces of paper? Sorry." Now, we won't do it explicitly. There's always, some fancy workout. Well, you exchange current debt for long-term debt that has a low
yes,
interest payment, and so on and so forth. But
right,
so inflation is the same thing as default. Essentially, just a question of who bears that burden.
yeah,
Default's a little worse in that there's explicit financial market problems. You tank the financial
right,
system if you actually default.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
um,
And
but
has it been the case historic? I mean, again, my understanding of this is rather superficial, but historically, right? You say inflation and default are equivalent, but as you point out, default is different. Historically, countries have inflated away their debts, right? I mean, that's kind of been the sort of under the radar way to default. Is that not, or am I thinking about that incorrectly?
Well, there's two kinds. There's countries that people trust enough to buy their debt denominated in their own currency, like the
Yep.
U.S.
Yeah.
And those countries have typically chosen the inflation route rather than the default route,
Yeah. Right. Right.
but not always. It's
Yeah.
also it's funny that we presume government debt is the safest possible thing in the world, and that shows some historical myopia. Starting with the one I know of. There's inflation. Emperor Diocletian had a big inflation at 300 AD when he couldn't pay his soldiers, and so he devalued the coins. Uh, the Peruzzi Bank failed when it lent a lot of money to King Edward III of England. I think it's like 1350-ish. Ever since then, government debt's been a terrible investment because there's no collateral, and so they tend to default on it, inflate it away with remarkable frequency.
Yeah.
So both of those tend to happen. Now, the U.S., like most of the Western world, has built up a tremendous reputation for repaying its debts. You saw the musical Alexander Hamilton.
Mhm.
The U.S. is going to repay those debts, even though we didn't, in some sense, have to. And by doing so, you get the reputation that lets you borrow again when you run
Yep.
into trouble, which is
Yep.
exactly what Hamilton's repayment did. So
Yep.
there's always the temptation to default, and then like Argentina, you can default once, there goes the debt. But now Now you got a problem. If we defaulted on our debt, okay, great. Next year, who's going to lend us 5% of GDP for our current deficits? Nobody.
Sure.
So
Right.
inflating away the debt or defaulting on the debt would actually make the whole problem worse because then
Yeah.
nobody will lend
Sure.
to you again.
What do you make, John, of the gold price and what that sort of tells us about what we're talking about here, about the trust in government debt, especially U.S. debt? I mean, is there anything there that we're being told by that by that by that?
Yeah, the gold price, that's just a classic indicator. People tend to
Yeah.
buy gold, a terrible long run asset, but when they're worried about inflation. There's other market prices though that aren't sending huge signals right now. So
Yeah.
you can look at inflation futures, inflation swaps, the implied inflation expectations in the difference between the Treasury inflation protected and non-protected securities. You can look at survey forecasts. None of those are screaming inflation, but none of those have ever screamed inflation. So
Okay.
the big inflations have always surprised the bond market. Look at the bond market in the 1970s. Uh, Long-term interest rates never went up ahead of the inflation. They were
Mm,
always surprised. Long-term
mm.
interest rates didn't come down with the disinflation. They were surprised. Why? Because inflation is like stock prices. Did I say this once before?
You
If
can
we
do
knew
it.
it was
Yeah.
coming next year, we
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
have already raised our prices this year. So
Oh,
inflation will always be hard to forecast. And if you start to see expectations embedded in surveys, which we are starting to see surveys climbing up, long-term bond rates climbing up, gold climbing up, then that is a definite worry. But uh, beware that there will also always be big surprises.
sure. Well, thanks, John. To wrap up, I guess we just kind of ask you just very broadly, given where we are right now and your concerns, if you were designing a policy agenda at the moment to sort of stimulate the growth that you want to see and sort of get our fiscal house in order, what would the John Cochrane agenda look like? What would that be?
Well, for the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute, I have to turn down the question in some sense. We don't elect kings.
Well, sure.
we,
Yeah.
we
Okay. Yeah.
have a process. No, and this is important. I think I've very much been a fan of much, except the tariffs, of what the Trump administration has done. Deregulation, not committing energy suicide, thinking about tax reform, reforming the universities. But with that, the method is a little bit worrisome. Executive orders issued under a declared state of emergency is not how we do things in America. So, and since I want long-term economic policy to be better,
Right.
I would want to see the process be better, first of all. So the answer would be, even though I have all the right answers, don't elect me king for the day, because when we do elect kings who issue executive orders, they can sometimes do a lot of things right, and then they screw up.
Sure.
And the process, 9 things done right and 1 thing done terribly wrong actually is very damaging. And the point of process, consensus, passing some actual laws is to make it permanent. Let me appeal to the deepest Trump supporter in the audience. You may love what's going on, but when the Democrats take over, they will declare a national emergency for climate change and gender equity and start passing executive orders under
Mm,
that. That's
mm.
not how we need to do things. So I'm sorry, preamble, but now elect me dictator for a day,
Sure,
or
sure. Now you're dictator. Yes, go. Yeah,
president for a day.
yeah.
Uh, we focus on the small things. So I do think America is ripe for fundamental reforms of the sort that, interestingly, small countries seem able to do, but America seems unable to do. Our tax system is a mess. Just look at the Swiss cheese of deductions and exclusions and so forth. Throw it out, put in a broad-based consumption tax. Everything gets taxed the same. You will never send in a Form 1040 again. The tax code will be 5 pages long. Uh, we could do that, and that would just unleash economic growth. Regulation, I don't like to say deregulation, I like to say smart regulation, but when you look at the level of things the federal government has its nose in. Yeah, I just found out there's a regulation on how a federal regulation on how you split tips between the wait staff and the cooks. Are you kidding? Labor laws should be about one postcard law about basic things you have to, not zero, but effective smart regulation is important. You know, get out. We're getting finally out of the way of energy. Stop the government management. Look what the government has done to the car industry and the energy industry. Everywhere they stick their noses, they come from. Healthcare. There's a very simple free market healthcare. You know, just get out of the way. Yes, provide for the unfortunate and the poor, but don't screw up your and my healthcare along the process the way they're doing. So, tax reform, clever, you know, Marie Kondo the whole of our incredibly overcomplicated public life. Why does it take 10 years to get the permits to connect a solar panel to the grid? I'm going to appeal to the greenies out there. You know, I'm delighted Democrats are discovering that, you know, you want housing is a crisis. Why does it take 10 years to get a permit to build any houses? And then you're not allowed to build up the most natural and environmentally sustainable place. So that level of microeconomic reform, which has to be institutional reform, it comes down to, you know, remember property rights. I can build on my piece of land what I want to with a lot less interference from the government. So I'm giving you the outlines of
Okay,
a
sure. Yeah.
reversion to basic rights and free markets, which I think the economy would just explode.
Really? Okay. All right. And also, John, thank you for that reminder. Yeah, and especially executive orders. You know, they can be overturned and new ones put in. But you know, when you're looking for durable change, that process is super important.
You know, it's fun. I've sort of been a regulation person, but an anti-regulation person. But I now start to look back fondly on the days when administrative agencies had drafts and public
Mm.
comment and cost
Yeah.
benefit analysis and followed the Administrative Procedures Act and submitted it to congressional review. Boy, those were the good old days.
Yeah. Yeah. More red tape, please. Yeah. That's funny. Well, John, thanks. You know, it's always such a joy to have you on, and I know our audience learned so much from you. So thanks for making the time today to talk with us.
Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed your economics lecture.
Yeah.